Today, we are diving into a condition that is often misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and emotionally devastating: interstitial cystitis, sometimes referred to as painful bladder syndrome. Welcome back to the Mind Change Podcast. I'm your host, Heather McKean. If you're loving these episodes, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave us a review. It really helps this work reach more people who are ready to explore their health through a deeper lens. Like many other conditions we explore here, IC isn't just about the bladder. It's about survival patterns, stored rage, and a deep, often unspoken desire to reclaim power. So many of our clients have come to us after years of frustration, feeling like their body's attacking them or that healing is out of reach. But what if interstitial cystitis wasn't your body betraying you, but communicating with you instead? So let's dig in. What is interstitial cystitis? Other than a condition very difficult to say, it's a chronic condition causing bladder pressure, bladder pain, and sometimes pelvic pain. Symptoms often mimic a urinary tract infection. There can be urgency, burning, and discomfort, but without an actual infection present. It disproportionately affects women and is often accompanied by a long history of trauma, disempowerment, and repression of emotion, especially anger. From a mind change perspective, this makes sense. The bladder is symbolically connected to the release of pressure, boundaries, and our relationship with power and emotional expression. When these areas are chronically restricted, our body speaks up, sometimes in very painful ways. So let's explore what this pain might be saying. To understand the emotional roots of IC, we have to look back often to early childhood experiences that trained the nervous system to suppress emotion, brace against the world, and internalize rage. The bladder, symbolically and somatically, is a reservoir of unexpressed emotions. And in cases of IC, it's often overflowing with pressure that was never allowed to be released safely. So let's look at some of the most common patterns that we've seen in our mind change clients with IC. There is often chronic powerlessness or forced submission. So children who grew up in an authoritarian household or possibly an authoritarian school or church environment where rules were rigid, questioning wasn't allowed, and autonomy was punished, often learned to internalize anger as a survival strategy. If your no wasn't allowed, your body found another way to say it. IC can be a visceral scream for boundaries that were never permitted early in life. Another common one is unexpressed rage toward authority figures. Many people with IC harbor a deep, unmetabolized rage toward a parent, guardian, teacher, or even a religious figure who misused their power. Because children cannot often safely express anger toward these figures, then ultimately that rage gets buried. So it simmers, it burns, and it eventually inflames, often in the pelvis. Another frequent addition to childhood environments that create IC later in life is sexual shame. So this one's harder to name, but deeply important. So we often see IC show up in individuals who were either sexualized too early, sexually coerced, or made to feel shame about their bodies and their boundaries and some of the natural things that their body would have done. Even if the abuse wasn't seen as abuse, or if it was never physical, the energy of manipulation or confusion around sexuality can be deeply destabilizing. And then the bladder becomes the place where grief, confusion, and anger is stored. So also there's a contributing factor within family systems that were built on suppression and injustice. One of the things that we commonly see with IC is where injustice was normalized. So that looks like maybe scapegoating the child, or if there were a narcissistic parent, or there was unspoken abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, any type of abuse that was not addressed or spoken about. Children in these families are often taught not to speak up, or they're even told, don't feel that way, or keep the peace no matter what it costs you. Or this idea of what happens within the family stays in the family. But here's the thing, your bladder never agreed to that. And eventually the cost becomes too high. Another contributing factor that we see is being forced into roles of peacemaker or mediator. So some children become the emotional go-between when there's a high conflict home, especially if there's warring parents. So we can see this in divorces or even parents that stick together but are at odds with each other quite a lot. Can even be sometimes when there is a lot of tension between the parents and a particular sibling, or between some of the older siblings in the family. So these kids who are in these family environments often develop bladder or pelvic issues because their nervous systems are absorbing conflict. That absorbed conflict doesn't get processed. So they feel trapped in the dynamics that they didn't choose. And IC can emerge later as a subconscious boundary, kind of like a line in the sand, a desperate attempt to say, I can't hold on to this any longer. Each one of these patterns and more shares one central theme: suppressed boundaries plus emotional pressure with no safe release. IC isn't just about the bladder. It's about what got trapped there. So if we fast forward these childhood experiences to adulthood, then we see that they surface in pretty unmistakable ways, often right before or alongside an interstitial cystitis flare. Here are some of the reoccurring themes we hear from clients. Boundary fatigue. So this would be someone who often says yes when they actually want to say no. So you compromise yourself to accommodate others, to keep the peace. So on the outside, you look agreeable, obedient, respectful, but inside you're seething. The bladder responds with urgency. It burns and there's pain. It's the way of declaring that the boundary that should be set, that you won't set, should be there. So the bladder's the thing now declaring the boundary that you refuse to set. Okay, another one is this kind of idea of smoldering, right? The unresolved anger is something that is common for many IC sufferers. So they tend to bounce between two extremes, like very strong outward politeness and obedience, but then inward having private rage parties or like fantasies of getting back at people or people getting hurt or, bad things happening to these people that they feel like they're carrying all this anger about. See, your body carries the anger that you never learned to express safely. So every IC flare is the somatic reminder that the fire is still lit, that there are unresolved coals smoldering at your core, and it's asking you to pay attention. Another really common pattern that we see is this kind of I can't let go or over-controlling pattern. So whether it's someone who does like hypervigilant scheduling, or maybe they're over-monitoring or trying to control their children or a partner, or they are someone who has a lot of perfectionism about their environment or work or all of those different things. For these people, control feels like safety. Yet, control keeps the nervous system on permanent alert, hypervigilance. And the bladder is designed for periodic release. So the bladder now mirrors what is happening in the mind. It's that refusal to relax, that refusal to let go of the things that are keeping you safe, which are actually keeping you stuck. So control is a very big contributor to IC. Another thing that's very frequently seen is sexual disconnection or pain associated with sex. Long buried experiences of shame, coercion, boundary violations, or even just confusion around our sexual self often translates into pelvic tension, which can look like reduced desire or pain during intimacy. IC arrives as the body's very loud objection to any scenario that even remotely echoes those past violations. Another common thing we see in IC is that people tend to have a chronic victim narrative. And that's because life has repeatedly felt unfair. People see themselves as a victim because they have proof of how much they have been victimized. But for these people, it's easy to get stuck in a loop, a feedback loop of blame and shame and victimization. But that narrative holds anger in a very closed situation, burying anger. So they're victimized and they keep thinking about and rehearsing and replaying all the ways that they've been victimized. And anger would be a very natural emotion to come out feeling that way. But again, they don't usually do anger, they do victimization, pushing the anger down again, which fuels the very inflammation that perpetuates IC. Until that story is rewritten and you go from victim to victor, those symptoms continue speaking up. Another factor that we can see is power reversal in relationships. Adults with IC frequently attract or feel trapped by a particular type of partner, boss, or institution that ends up replaying a power imbalance that they felt in their childhood. So each bladder flare is a physiologic protest against perpetuating and getting back into these old powerless roles. So the flares are angry at the situation. Like, are we doing this again? Because your boss reminds you of an authority figure from your childhood, or you may have married your controlling mother in your husband or wife, or your distant father. So many different things. If you are finding those situations and repeating those behaviors, then the bladder will be talking to you. Another one that we see is grief and loss of self. So what I mean by that is underneath the irritation is actually grief. There's grief for the loss of opportunities, for the loss of innocence, or the feeling that you've never really been able to feel safe from a very early age. IC can signal that it's time to mourn what was lost, to let go, to go back, empower yourself, move forward in a different way so that the body can stop carrying the weight of all of those uncried tears. These patterns are not moral failings. They are survival strategies whose season has passed. The good news is that anything learned for survival can be unlearned for freedom. So we're going to next talk about and explore the mind change approach a little bit, how we help clients identify the original emotional contracts driving IC and finally release the pressure that their bodies have been holding. So let's talk about the bladder a little bit more. And again, not just biologically, but symbolically. As we talked about in many somatic and metaphysical frameworks, the bladder represents the ability to let go, the reservoir for what the body is holding on to but no longer needs. So it holds, waits, then releases. But what happens when that release becomes painful, blocked, or inflamed? That's when we need to ask a deeper question. What am I still holding on to? And why can't I let it go? Interstitial cystitis often shows up when someone is carrying a backlog of emotions, usually rage, resentment, humiliation, or grief, and they don't have a safe or acceptable place to put it, or they've not been taught how to process these emotions, how to even identify these emotions, let them rise, and then process them or integrate them. Oftentimes, they learned from a very young age that expressing emotion is dangerous, selfish, or shameful. So they continue to hold on to it and hold on to it until it burns. The bladder is also tied to territory and personal power, because think about it. Animals mark their territory with urine. For humans, the bladder reflects how we relate to our own space, safety, and autonomy. If someone has repeatedly violated our boundaries, physically, emotionally, or energetically, we may conclude subconsciously that my space isn't really mine. I don't get to decide what happens to me. I'm not allowed to have needs, or my boundaries won't be noticed anyway, so it doesn't matter if I have them. So instead of enforcing boundaries, then people internalize conflict. So we swallow the rage, suppress the grief, and direct all of it inward and downward. In this light, the inflammation in IC begins to make sense. It's the body's way of expressing something the conscious mind has never had permission to say. I'm angry. I am tired of being the one that holds it all together. This is not okay. People need to respect my boundaries, my thoughts, my feelings, my space. And again, this is usually stemming from a childhood where safety was conditional, where someone in power, often a caregiver, was inconsistent, unfair, controlling, or abusive. And it was well learned that to stay safe meant survival. To survive, I needed to stay quiet, small, stay out of the way. And that becomes that deeply wired survival strategy. Don't rock the boat, don't show emotion, stay in control at all costs, keep the peace even if it costs you your body. And here's the thing, this is what I've found. Many people with IC who are doing IC actually have some self-awareness. They've been trying to do some work. Oftentimes when people come to us, they've been in therapy, they've read the books, they've tried the diets. They know something emotional is happening, but their body is still in lockdown mode because the subconscious doesn't yet feel safe to release. That's why we don't fight the body. We don't shame it. Instead, we get curious. We listen. We learn to interpret the inflammation, but not as failure, as communication, protection, as an SOS, because symptoms are rarely the problem. They're often the solution the body chose when no other solution was available. And once we truly understand that, we can begin to unwind the pattern at its root. One of the most important and often overlooked aspects of chronic conditions like interstitial cystitis is something we call secondary gains. At first, it might sound strange or even offensive to suggest that there's any kind of benefit to suffering, but that's not what we mean. What we're talking about here is a subconscious protection. We see it time and time again that when the body produces chronic symptoms, especially those that don't respond to traditional treatment, those symptoms are often serving a deeper purpose beneath conscious awareness. So let's look at some of the common subconscious reasons a person might develop or retain IC symptoms. And again, we've talked about this numerous times, but this is one of the biggest things, and that is physical boundaries. If you were not allowed to say no, set boundaries, protect your space, your body's going to do it for you. Pain, urgency in feeling pelvic things, feelings. They often force separation from others. They demand attention. They oftentimes prevent us from being close, especially sexually, but even sometimes relationally. Because if the body has learned that intimacy equals danger, then that inflammation becomes a protector. Another secondary gain is anger without permission to express it, meaning that repressed anger that we've talked about a ton here with IC is being stored. Remember, it's really being held somewhere, looking for a place to come out. So that's what the bladder is doing. It becomes the container for that unspoken rage. Holding urine becomes symbolic for holding pain. Urinary urgency becomes the metaphoric need for emotional urgency. And then, of course, there's the relationship with control. Again, painful or unpredictable childhood environments train the brain to seek control of the body, food, time, relationships, children, circumstances. IC symptoms give someone a reason to say no, to cancel plans, to avoid vulnerability. It creates predictability. I can't do that. I am having a flare. It gives structure to a system that never learned internal regulation. So that pain creates distance from situations, people, jobs, things that may feel unsafe, even if we chose to be involved with them. It acts as a boundary mechanism, and it, again, can be related to sexual trauma, emotionally enmeshed parents, or simply growing up in a household where you feel like your body didn't belong to you, or your time didn't belong to you, or your emotions didn't belong to you. So now your body says, I will decide when I'm touched. I will decide when I'm close. And right now, I need space. IC can also be a way for the body to talk when your voice wasn't heard, taken, listened to. If you were punished, ignored, or gaslit for expressing truth, your body may become the one place where your truth gets heard. Pain becomes the language. Urgency becomes the story. And symptoms become the vehicle through which long-buried truths finally emerge. Now, none of this means you're making the symptoms up. It means that your body is brilliant, doing whatever it must to keep you emotionally and physically safe, even if that safety comes at a cost. The good news is these patterns aren't permanent. When we work through the subconscious, we can identify the specific protection strategy that's running the show. And when that strategy is no longer needed, when your nervous system feels safe, when your voice returns, when your boundaries are honored, the symptoms often begin to fade. Because once the subconscious realizes that you're no longer in the same threat environment, it doesn't need to protect you in the same way. If you are still with me, chances are that this episode has stirred something, maybe an emotional thread that you hadn't fully pulled yet, maybe a recognition that what you've been experiencing isn't just in your body or in your head, but also rooted in your life experience, in what you did to have to survive. So then the question becomes, how do I begin to heal? How do I untangle these subconscious patterns instead of chasing symptom relief or attempting to regulate the nervous system in isolation? Well, we start where true transformation happens, in the subconscious mind. At Mind Change, we believe that the nervous system follows the mind, not the other way around. Trying to regulate your nervous system while your subconscious is still wired with trauma, anger, betrayal, and powerlessness is like putting fresh paint over a crumbling wall. It might look okay for a moment, but it won't hold. That dysregulation will return because the underlying blueprint hasn't changed. We go directly to the source. We work to uncover the original wiring, the early, often hidden memories, and beliefs that you were told. Things like you're unsafe, your powerlessness, you're not allowed to be angry, your needs don't matter, authority always wins. Through our proprietary techniques, we help rewire those subconscious patterns, not just to cope with life, but to change it. And what happens when the subconscious mind truly shifts? The nervous system responds naturally and sustainably. The body softens, the inflammation quiets, safety returns, not because you forced it, but because you finally believe it's possible. That is the way to healing. Not bypassing trauma with techniques, but transforming trauma at the root. You don't have to live angry, tense, victimized, or in pain. You don't have to keep reenacting betrayal in your relationships or suppression within your body. When you reclaim your inner authority on a subconscious level, your body no longer has to fight for your attention. It can begin to trust you again. It can begin to heal. Let me quickly share an example of a woman I worked with. Let's call her Melissa. Melissa came to me after years of struggling with interstitial cystitis. She had tried everything: strict diets, pelvic floor therapy, rounds of antibiotics, mindfulness practices, and finally surgery, but nothing brought lasting relief. What stood out in the beginning of our time together was her language, because she described her body as betraying her and felt like she was always under attack. She also used the phrase, "I'm just so done with people," multiple times in our conversation. As we began to unpack her subconscious story, a theme quickly emerged: unresolved rage and helplessness toward her father, who had been emotionally abusive and controlling. As a child, she had no ability to escape. Her only strategy was to repress her anger until her body started screaming on her behalf. Through Mind Change, we worked to identify and rewire the original memories and beliefs that her nervous system was still looping on. She had carried the belief, if I speak up, I'll be punished, and I have to hold everything in to survive. In our session work, when she finally gave her younger self permission to express the fury, the rage she had buried for decades, her body visibly shifted. Her face softened. Her breathing deepened. And a few weeks later, she emailed to say, for the first time in years, she had gone multiple days without pain. But more than that, she felt peace. She told me, I didn't realize how much of my life was shaped by what I couldn't say. Now my body doesn't have to say it for me. That's the work. That's what healing through the subconscious looks like. We don't manage the body's symptoms. We listen to them and then help the mind write a new story. We don't just treat the condition. We treat the pattern that created it. Also, please check out next week's episode where you're going to hear from Vicky, another client who suffered terribly from IC for many years, involving surgeries every few months to manage the pain. Tune in and listen to her incredible story of healing from interstitial cystitis. It's not just a bladder issue. It's not a chronic pain syndrome. It's not just inflammation or tissue dysfunction. It's not something to be managed with medications, bladder installations, or pelvic floor therapy. From a mind change perspective, IC is the body's urgent plea to be heard, to finally release the emotional charge, the grief, rage, and fear that it's been holding on to. When you've been silenced, dismissed, violated, or controlled, especially from a young age, your system is going to equate safety with silence. Be nice, be good, keep it in, don't rock the boat. But your body, it didn't forget, and it won't be silenced forever. So however that's showing up for you, the body is wanting to say, I'm angry, scared, exhausted from holding everything in. And we listen to the body saying it needs a new story. If you're ready to take the next step, we'd love to talk with you. You can schedule a free consultation with one of us, and we'll help set you up with your personalized next step for your healing journey. Just visit mindchange.com to get started. Thanks again for joining us on the Mind Change podcast, where we are changing the world one mind at a time.